Well, hello again. We're back. Yeah, Jason Isaacs, everybody else. And this time we're trying with a webcam. Who knows? It may work. You may find it's massively distracting. But I'm sure that one way or another you will let me know. Right, okay, so thanks. Right, so we were talking earlier about how these guys here were effectively the executive. We had that sort of bicuspid. What was the word I was looking for? Anyway, that two elements to the two elements to the executive. These ones, of course, representing the political. These ones essentially the admin. And then we have the same bicameral legislator there. These guys representing the states, the EU states, and these ones representing the EU people. And in that respect, they were analogous effectively to the Senate, certainly pre-17th Amendment in the United States, and analogous again to the states, the House of Representatives. Not an exact analogy, but it may help you when you're going through it. Just to remember that these guys here, the Council of Ministers, speak for the interests of the nation states, and these people here speak for the European people elected on a national basis. Good. On a European basis, on a European constituency basis. Good. So let's push on. And we went through all of this, and we went through this, and we pretty much got to the European Parliament. So here we go. We have the entire European Parliament, and that's what it is. Yes, so in May we will be electing 73 members for good or ill. They will be going there for how long? Who knows? Yep, we will be doing that. And of course, all of that is covered in a different presentation from me on party lists. So those are elected by party lists, and you should know all about those. If you don't, check out my video. I'll link off to it at the end. Right, so once in the European Parliament, people sit in groups. Apologies for the clumsy edit. I just wanted to check something there. Groups in the EU Parliament parties in the EU Parliament sit according to groups. What I stopped to look up was the date of something, because something quite significant. David Cameron moved the Conservatives from this group here to this group here. That was largely an effort to appease the Brexiteers and the sort of further right elements of the Conservative Party. And that happened in 2009. Is that going to come up in the exam? Probably not. But it's just an illustration of how these things work. So the Conservative Party used to be parked in this group, but then they moved to this group. And as you get further and further around there, it gets more and more extreme. But anyway, we're not talking about that at the minute. Key point is that here we have a huge, great assembly, 751 people. We're just under 10% of that. At least we were at time of going to press. That's about as much as we can say there. Again, the important thing here, they are the only directly elected institution of the EU. Directly elected meaning elected by EU constituencies, and they share powers with the Council of Ministers, and they cannot initiate legislation. When we come back to look at democratic deficit, that might be a point that you choose to make. Democratic deficit. But it remains the only directly elected element of the EU, of the EU, basically. Everybody else that's elected is elected on a national basis and is then sent along to the EU system, rather like the Council of Ministers. So each country sends over a minister. Ours is currently Alan Duncan. He sits at Cabinet. I don't know, he must have a seat at Cabinet. Technically, he is the Minister for Europe and the Americas, and that sits within the Foreign Office. But every now and again, he'll get up and he'll move over to Brussels and sit in the Council of Ministers. And this is the other half of the legislature. Again, kind of analogous to the Senate in the United States, certainly the Senate pre-17th Amendment. Speaking for the interests of the member states of the EU in the legislature, the same way that the members of the US Senate speak for the interests of their state in the wider US legislative mechanism. Anyway, that's out there, and they're half of the legislature, as we said. They don't have a straight-up vote. They have something called a double majority. Once upon a time, the ministers of the council used to have a veto. Then they got rid of that, and they replaced it with QMV, and now they got rid of that, and they're working on this double majority. What that is, you don't really need to know in the context of this particular exercise, but what it does mean is that it's impossible for one country to block a decision on which everybody else agrees. Whether that's democratic deficit or not, well, I'll leave you to decide, but certainly something that you might want to think about as you're going through it. So this is what the Council of Ministers actually do. Again, they are half of the Legislative Assembly. They are appointed by their national governments, and they go over and they sit over there. They are bound by collective responsibility and all that sort of stuff. But yes, that's about as much as I can say, really, on the Council of Ministers. Certainly about as much as you need to know. Okay, European Court of Justice. This is an independent entity, so we would expect it not to be elected. Interesting little point. One of the things that the more volatile members of the anti-European press in this country tend to say as they rant on about European judges making decisions for British citizens. Well, actually, one of those judges is British, and it's not that remote entity. It's not a remote ECJ that's kind of is, because judges are independent. But again, we have judges from the UK on that bench, and the EU will listen to representations from the UK if we think they've made a mistake, and we saw that with the life tariff business. Again, different presentation ready on that. I will link off to it in the links. But the life tariff issue shows how our judges can make representations back to the ECJ saying, we think you've got it wrong. And they will think again and, well, quite possibly, as they did with life tariffs, agree with our judges and change their ruling. Right. That's about it for the institutions. In terms of policy areas, this is of vital importance. And where you stand on the EU really depends whether or not you think that what they're doing over here is worth what they're doing over here. So this is where you have to weigh things up. This is what the EU is there to do. It's there to protect jobs. It's there to protect the supply of goods and services. Hey, you guys can read. All of that, it does. But it does at a cost. And this is the cost over here. And of course, it could be more efficient in this area, but it's more efficient than it was. This really is the big argument about Europe. Is what we've got going on over here worth the price that we are paying over there? So I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions on that. I may come up with a different presentation at a later date that explains where I stand on that. Just a little thing here about the consistent rights there across member states. That's not just about consumers. Obviously, it's great for us if we know that when we buy a toaster from a European country that it meets the same health and safety standards that we expect of manufacturers in the UK. So, that's good for us, and it helps to know that all of our food is processed to the same standards and so on. However, this also helps suppliers. It also helps the producers of these things, because they know that if something can be sold in the UK, then it can also be sold in France and Germany and Poland and Italy and all of these other places without having to restructure either the packing mechanism or indeed the manufacturing process. So there you go. We're going to talk about the environmental agenda shortly, because that's an area where you're going to find some very interesting stuff in terms of policy. We keep coming back to policy and the extent to which it intrudes the extent to which the EU intrudes on UK policy sovereignty. And definitely in terms of pollution, as it says there, pollution knows no borders. And Natura was an EU directive that was issued by the environmental agency within the EU. And this is how directives work. So directives are a broad sort of policy area. There will be all sorts of specific areas within that directive. But when it comes to applying that directive, countries have a large degree of discretion in the minutiae. So on one hand, we're submitting a degree of sovereignty because we agree to follow this directive. But on the other hand, within that directive, there is a degree to which we can fine-tune those policies to fit our particular environment. I'll link off to the Natura 2000 in the links at the end, but that's a very nice way of looking at the way in which some European regulation or some European directives are applied. Other stuff that we've obviously got a coordinated approach, a relatively coordinated approach to global climate change. We know all about this, the ECHR. Now note that this is not an EU law. This is something above and beyond everything that's happening within the EU. It's not actually. Sorry, I'm talking about the European Convention on Human Rights, which was adopted into the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. But the ECHR is a separate entity relative to the UK EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which has interesting knock-on effects when it comes to whether or not the government can disapply legislation. But I don't want the courts, in the UK can disapply legislation. But let's not go there right now. Erasmus, this may be of interest to students who are out there. It's a tremendous opportunity to go and study abroad before that particular thing expires. Whether or not you agree with this is going to be a feature of where you stand on the Brexit debate. And we talked about consumer rights there. Again, consumer rights, that's fantastic. But again, this means that there are consistent standards across the entire UK. So somebody selling a widget in the UK can sell it equally well across the entirety of Europe. Right, okay. That's about as much as I want to get into in this particular presentation. But what I'll leave you with are these two things. Most questions are going to be about democracy and sovereignty. Specifically in terms of democracy, how democratic is the EU, or is there a democratic deficit? And this is going to be up to you to decide based upon the institutions, the nature of the institutions. Are they elected? Are they appointed? The elections themselves, do they work? Do you have a big turnout? Do people use them as protest votes, etc., etc., etc.? Thinking ahead here to the end of May. And where does power lie within the EU? So if you can answer all of those questions, then you're going to be in a position to explain exactly exactly the extent to which the EU suffers from a democratic deficit, if indeed it does. And it probably does. In terms of sovereignty, this is a much more interesting question. This is the extent to which you're prepared to give up sovereignty in order to enjoy the benefits that follow from membership. If you're a member of a club and the club says, well, you can't come in unless you're wearing a tie, then, those are the rules. If you don't like that, don't join the club. You inevitably give up a bit of sovereignty, a bit of autonomy to accrue membership benefits that follow from whatever it is that you want to do. So you need to work out the extent to which governments have to do as they're told, or the extent to which governments can do what they want. And again, key things there, things like Schengen and the euro, and the nature of directives. In terms of Parliament, what you're looking at is the fact that we got in by law, we can get out by law. And the only reason why Parliament is bound by EU law at the minute is because we passed a law that said we would be. That is the European Communities Act of 72. The Brexit Bill in 16 essentially reversed that, and so we are no longer, or at least there will apparently be a point at which we are no longer legally bound to EU legislation. And of course, in terms of the courts, that's the extent to which we have judicial certainty. To what extent can our judges come up with a decision that's going to be final? Now, while we're playing part of the EU game, we may see judges in the EU, particularly in the ECJ, take a different view of things. And again, that's the nature of the legal system. All the way through our legal system, we'll have one court coming up with one thing, and then the next higher court perhaps agreeing, perhaps not agreeing. The key thing here is that the difference between that in our system, in our system, if the High Court comes up with a ruling and the Supreme Court says, no, we disagree, as they did, or as the House of Lords did in the Al Yamamah judicial review in 2010, there's nothing you can do about it. I'm about to run out of time. But in the EU, we can apply. We can appeal. So in the case of the life tariffs, the ECJ said life tariffs are not compatible with the ECHR, and we said, well, actually, we think you're misinterpreting our legislation, and it is. And they looked at it again, they went, okay, yeah, you got a point. So we're not just rule takers there from the EU, and we can have that dialogue with the courts, and if we think they're wrong, we can make a case, and sometimes they agree. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe, and do tell your friends, and do also tell your friends that if you like, I can do online tutorials. Do send me an email or catch me through Facebook, and I'll see you very, very soon. Thanks a lot. Bye now.